Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue in Austin, Texas. For more information about our public affairs forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Gene Randall. Uncle Gene Randall is a radio host of Indigenous Freedom Radio, an elder and Powwow Gourd Dancer in the Central Texas Indigenous community. A native of San Antonio, he grew up in an era of social upheaval and school desegregation at a time when identifying as Mexican American was difficult enough. As a public speaker, he has addressed issues of environmentalism, fossil fuel extraction, cultural preservation, and health topics. Let's welcome Gene Randall.
Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for having me, and I hope that my presentation today will be helpful. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today will maybe make some people angry. That's not my reason for being here. My purpose in doing these presentations and part of the responsibility that I feel I have as the radio host is mostly to educate the public. So a lot of what I present here, although it may sound harsh, I'm not against religion of any sort. I respect everyone's belief system, but these are the facts. First off, we're going to be talking about Indigenous perspective on racism. As Pastor Grimminger mentioned, my name is Gene Randall. I'm representing the Indigenous Cultures Institute this morning. Dr. Mario Garza and Maria Rocha could not make it, so I'm here to speak on their behalf. I also, as mentioned, host a radio show on a community radio station in San Marcos, kzsm.org. Actually, I host more than one show, but this is the show that I'm actually the proudest of. Indigenous Freedom Radio, we basically play music, of all indigenous artists or artists who have indigenous roots. A lot of people have no idea that even Jimi Hendrix, his mother was Cherokee, or that James Brown's mother was also indigenous. So, we play a lot of variety. Of course, we also try to play indigenous music from around the world as well, Aboriginal music from Australia. I have a young co-host who just loves panpipe music from South America. So, there's no and recently we've been playing Mongolian heavy metal, so there's no telling what you're going to hear on our program. Historically, there's one of the things I've been hearing for many years is Doctrine of Discovery. Well, Doctrine of Discovery is part of history, so let's take a look at the seed. The first papal bull. Now, people ask you, so what's the difference between a papal bull and an encyclical? I grew up as a Catholic, and popes have the tendency to make these proclamations, and the difference between a papal bull and a encyclical. But now, historically, bulls were issued, and the reason they were called bulls is because they use a bulla or a stamp, because this was an official pronouncement made by the Pope that affected the entire church. Today, you see more, or you hear more about encyclicals. Like when I was growing up, the encyclical on birth control that the Catholic Church has adopted. There's not a lot of difference in the effect that it has. There's just a difference in how these things are issued. But the first papal bull that affected indigenous cultures from around the world was issued in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V. And what it did is this was at the beginning of European exploration. The Portuguese were already venturing off into new worlds, and the Dom Diversas, issued by Pope Nicholas, basically said that you can conquer the Saracens and the pagans and consign them to perpetual servitude. Think about that. Now, this is the very beginning. This was followed later by the Romanus Pontifex. Now, at that point, the Portuguese were not the only people who were exploring the New World. There were other countries who were sending out emissaries and trying to find riches and whatever. At this point, there had been conflicts between the Portuguese and all these others. So a bull was written in 1454 by Pope Nicholas V, and it was basically sent to King Alfonso of Portugal. And again, this also encouraged the seizure of lands of Saracen Turks and non-Christians. And this is a key point, because it basically repeated the earlier permission about the enslavement of such peoples. Basically, what the church and the Pope was telling these explorers was, when you come across cultures, around the world or in your ventures or exploration, if these people do not convert to Christianity, then you can take their possessions, you can do pretty much whatever you want, make them slaves. And so this is actually the very start of what we see now today as racism and marginalization of indigenous cultures. Now, after Columbus sailed to the New World and discovered indigenous cultures, the Taínos in the Indies, another bull was issued in May of 1493, and this one was issued to the King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Obviously, we all know these are the people who funded Columbus's exploration. And at this point, though, because of the conflicts between the Portuguese and all the other explorers, the Pope said, okay, this is where I'm going to draw the line. And it describes it there as west and south of a pole, from a line for 100 leagues west and south of any of the islands of the Azores or the Cape Verde Islands. Now, I know it's hard to visualize this. I do have a map. And basically between this point and this point, everything west and south of that was now fair game to Columbus and any further explorers coming out of Spain or anywhere else. It's not a very, very good map, so we're not going to dwell on that, but just to give you the point. So let's start with some definitions. First, the definition of race. What is race? We hear it a lot. Race is something that was actually established by anthropologists. Now, if you know anything at all about scientific taxonomy, about the genus, phylum, and all that sort of stuff, have you ever seen race listed on any of that? It's not. It's not scientific. This was something that was actually made up by philosophers like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And basically, they were trying to categorize new groups of people. And, this, you may have heard of phrenology, where, they were collecting skulls of remains and basically comparing them, where the cranium is this much larger, so this person is more advanced than the person whose cranium is this much smaller. This whole concept of race was being exploited throughout the expanding European colonialism. So racism, by definition, is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Now, folks, let me tell you something. Probably the biggest thing that's wrong with this world today is that anyone feels that they're superior to anyone else. And of course, there's an example of the use of the word racism and a lot of synonyms of racism. Racial discrimination, racialism, racial prejudice or bigotry, xenophobia, chauvinism, bigotry, bias, intolerance, anti-Semitism, and apartheid. Those are all based on race. So what is institutional racism? That's actually taking things a little bit further. Institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, is a form of racism that is expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It's also practiced by individuals or informal social groups governed by behavioral norms that support racist thinking. Anyway, you can read that. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But the whole point is, a lot of what we do today is based on institutional racism. You hear about racial profiling that police forces use. And I'm not saying this to pick out to point to police forces as demagogues or anything like that. It's just that because of our way of thinking that has become so ingrained in the way we conduct our day-to-day affairs, institutional racism is generally accepted without even thinking about it. We don't think about that. So what is an indigenous person? Today you'll hear a lot of things, indigenous people self-identifying as Native American or natives or even Indian. Now, when you think about those terms, some of those terms are actually very confusing and very vague. Now, someone who I admire a lot, who's now no longer with us, John Trudell, basically told us that, we are not Native Americans because we existed before America was even an idea. We are the people. The people are, and indigenous are originating or occurring naturally in a particular place, as in native to this country, native to this continent. And there's some more synonyms, and you can look this up. This is not rocket science. And I will use that expression, rocket science. A lot of this is not rocket science. So indigenous peoples are also known as First Peoples in Canada. Generally indigenous people are referred to as First Nations. Here in the United States, we refer to our people here as indigenous. And there's actually a lot of, because of institutional racism, the whole idea of Mexicans being a whole different race of people than northern Native Americans is a fallacy, because we are all indigenous. Prior to colonization, there were no such things as borders, state lines. I mean, we used to call this Turtle Island. Well, we still call it, a lot of us still call it Turtle Island. And some people are like, well, why Turtle Island? If you look at the map of North America and use your imagination, it does look like a turtle. But the indigenous groups are usually described as indigenous when they maintain traditions or other aspects of an earlier culture or a language. Now, if you've never been to a powwow, or if you have been to a powwow, when you go there you see all sorts of different styles of dancing, music, singing, the drums. These are our traditions. And why do we have powwows? Because we want to pass this as a legacy down to our children. This is one way that we can assure that our culture will survive. Another is language. And here recently, a lot more effort has been gone into learning your indigenous language. In the United States, there are, well, I'll get to that in a minute. In Mexico, for example, there are over 500 indigenous languages, and lots of people who are native to that area are growing up and learning their indigenous language. A couple of years ago, I was in North Dakota during a little thing some of you may have heard of called the DAPL pipeline. And what impressed me when I was there is the children who were in the camp were being taught, their schooling was being taught in the Lakota language. And this is another one of the ways we endeavor to preserve our culture. Now, it's estimated that although there's no way of knowing for sure prior to colonization what the numbers of people who are already inhabiting North America, the numbers, we just have no idea. But it is estimated that about 90%, between 80 and 90% of the first century, within the first century of contact with Europeans, 80 to 90% of indigenous people who were living here already were decimated. So the numbers, pre-contact, like I said, it's hard to know what those numbers were. It's estimated somewhere between 112 million. Others estimates have been as low as 8 million. But by 1800, the native population of the present-day United States declined to approximately 600,000, and only 250 Native Americans remained in the 1890s. Those are large numbers, and a lot of people think, the worst genocide in history, of course, was during World War II and Hitler. Well, you know what? Hitler got his idea for genocide and concentration camps by the way he saw the indigenous people here in North America being treated by the U.S. government. So how does it become institutionalized? Well, basically by the adoption of the Doctrine of Discovery, or its tenets, into U.S. law. And this was done very slyly, let's say, by John Marshall, Chief Justice. Basically, he argued a case against, the case was called Johnson versus McIntosh, and basically his statement was that, where is it? Ultimate dominion over the lands of America during the Age of Discovery. He based it that upon discovery, the Indians had lost their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations and only retained the right of occupancy. Think about that. We were here first, and these people come in and say, well, okay, we don't care, about you, but this is the way we're going to do it. Basically, they took Doctrine of Discovery and incorporated it into U.S. law. How many nations? There are approximately 573 federally recognized Indian nations, also called tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, and native villages, depending on what part of the country you go to. Approximately 229 of these are ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse nations and that are located in Alaska and other federally recognized tribes in 35 other states. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of countries. And sovereignty basically means that as a sovereign nation, any dealings between these nations and the U.S. government would actually, by law, require some form of official emissary between the governments. That doesn't happen. It never has. And the interesting thing about the federally recognized tribes is that here in the state of Texas, there are absolutely 0 federally recognized tribes. There are lots of state-recognized tribes, but there are none that are federally recognized. And who recognizes them? Well, theoretically, the U.S. government. This is another quick map. I know it's real hard. It's not very clear, but all those little spots there are different nations with the names of those nations in the indigenous languages. And I can send you a copy of that at some point. So let's talk about civil rights. Basically, when it boils down to it, we haven't really had that many. It wasn't until 1924 that indigenous cultures or indigenous people were granted the right of citizenship. Think about that. Our grandparents, and that was after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Now, there were limited citizenship, but those individuals either had to marry someone who was already an American citizen, or sometimes, if they had served in our military, they were granted citizenship. But those were the exceptions. In 1965, we finally gained the right to vote in elections. How many years is that? 24, 6? Well, I'm not going to do the math. But that's a lot of years. So you're a citizen, but you can't vote yet. I mean, women had the right to vote before indigenous people. Part of the reason that it took so long, too, is I don't know how many, well, of course, it's before my time, but yeah, even before my time. Literacy tests and poll taxes, these were barriers. I mean, and this is something that you had to do. You had to pay a tax in order to be able to vote. And of course, being very poor people, who could afford the taxes? And then you had to take a literacy test. 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act. Finally, our native cultures, our native people were able to receive grants for education, funding for educational schools, academies, universities even. It wasn't until 1978, that's within our lifetime, the Religious Freedom Act was finally passed. So prior to that, any ceremony that any of our people wanted to perform had to be done in secrecy, in privacy, for fear of either being arrested, put into an asylum, or even being killed. And there was part of the reason it took so long, and I don't remember the year, one of the massacres occurred because one of the tribes was doing a ghost dance. And the Indian agent of that reservation feared that it was, they're getting ready for an uprising. This was actually a religious ceremony. Anytime you hear about people going to lodge, a sweat lodge, and even our form of dance, every form of dance in and of itself is a prayer. So when you go to the powwows and watch all these different styles of prayer, the origins of those dances come from prayers and ceremonies. But not until 1978 were we able to finally perform our religious ceremonies, rites, and anything else. And especially when it comes to ceremonies that include things like peyote. Oh my gosh, how illegal is that? Fortunately, we do that now. 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act. This is also very significant. As a matter of fact, I was just talking with a friend of mine on the way here this morning. Technically, if a child has to be removed from a native home, they should be put in the care of another indigenous family. Legally. It doesn't always happen that way. Part of this was the result of, the Carlisle Indian School. I don't know if you've ever heard about the residential school programs. Basically, the motto then was, kill the Indian and save the man. Basically, these children were taken out of their homes, placed in schools and residential programs miles and miles away from their origins. Their hair was cut. They were forbidden to speak their native languages. They were forbidden to do anything that had to do with their original indigenous culture because they wanted to basically whitewash these people and put them into modern day or into society at the time as they defined society should be. And William Henry Platt was actually one of the chief architects of the residential school program. And that's just 1 year, and that's right around 1900. And this wasn't, Carlisle Indian School was only one of many. And here in the United States as well as in Canada. And the real tragedy, not just the fact that our children were being taken out of our homes, the real tragedy is that many of these children died either by tuberculosis, a lot of them were abused, a lot of them were buried in unknown graves. Those remains will probably never be recovered. These are somebody's children. So where are we now and where do we go from here? According to the 2008 census projections, those who are Native American and Alaska Natives alone number 3.08 million of the total U.S. population, which is 304 million, which is about 1.01% of the population. And one thing I want to mention here real quick, because despite the fact that our portion of the population is such a fraction, when you look at people who serve in the military, our indigenous people serve in a much higher proportion than any other ethnic group in the country. And that's the topic for another day. But it's just something I wanted to. This is what today, and now this graph is actually a few years old. But look at this. The blue is the national average. Okay, the red is what we find today on reservations. Homes without electricity. 14% of homes on reservations do not have electricity, compared to 1% of the rest of the country. Homes without indoor plumbing. We take these things for granted. 20% as compared to 1%. Homes without adequate sewage disposal. I mean, outhouses. If you've ever had to go to an outhouse, especially in the middle of winter in North Dakota, it's not a pleasant thing to do. Homes without kitchen facilities, 18% compared to 1%. And homes without telephone service. Well, telephone used to be a luxury. Now it's pretty much essential. Heck, even cell phones. Everyone has to have a cell phone these days. But it doesn't always happen on reservations. Crime statistics. This gets actually very sad because according to the National Violence Against Women survey, 34% of American Indian and Alaskan Native women have suffered attempted or completed a rape. Now, what makes this even more tragic than the numbers is that 90% of the perpetrators are non-indigenous. And when you start talking about things like pipelines and man camps, again, that's another subject for another day. But American Indians experience per capita a rate of violence twice that of the U.S. resident population. On average, American Indians have experienced an estimated one violent crime for every 10 residents of age 12 or Among American Indians aged 25 to 34, the rate of violent crime victimizations was more than 2.5 times the rate for all persons of the same age. And that 2.5 times also goes over to the number of women who are violated. Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be, or statistically, 2.5 times more they have been subjected to some sort of violence 2.5 more times more than any other ethnic group in the United States today. Mortality rates. You know, people, you might hear about the Indian Health Service. You know, those hospitals are actually very few and far between. And now with funding being cut, you know, things like tuberculosis, 600% mortality rate compared to other Americans. And, you know, tuberculosis is not that difficult to contain. Alcoholism. Sadly, yes, alcoholism is a real serious problem. Alcoholism and substance abuse. And people ask me, well, you know, the people have choices. Well, most people have choices. When you live on a reservation and there are no jobs, education is virtually, well, it's improving, but the opportunities are not there. People have nothing to do all day just because they're required to stay on this reservation, or they don't have no other means of leaving the reservation. And alcohol stores that sell alcohol are very conveniently located just outside the perimeters of the reservation. Diabetes, sadly, that's another illness that inflicts a lot of our indigenous people. Have a very high rate of diabetes. Vehicle accidents, and maybe that's as a result of the drug and alcohol abuse. Injuries and suicide. Still, when you look at this, Indian youth have the highest rate of suicide among all ethnic groups in the U.S. Second leading cause of death for Native youth aged between the ages of 15 and 24. These people, these young people, are overwhelmed with a pervasive sense of uselessness. They have no future. You know, things are improving, but it's a very slow and a very gradual process. Education. Education is the key. What we tell people is everyone will fear an educated Indian. So we're working towards that. The number of American Indian and Alaska Native students enrolled in colleges and universities and the number of post-secondary degrees awarded has more than doubled in the past 30 years. And there are schools, and I'll get to that in a minute, but 5% of American Indians and Alaska Natives have received graduate or professional degrees, compared to 10% for the total population, and only 9% of American Indians have earned bachelor's degrees compared to 19% of the US population. The numbers are small, but I guarantee they are growing. American Indian Serving Institutions, also known as tribal colleges and universities, are schools in which American Indian and Alaska Native students constitute at least 25% of the total school enrollment. And these colleges and universities are in existence, and the number is increasing. Again, very slowly. And especially in a time where budget cuts and limited budgets, you know, are the rule of the day, it's a slow process. This is John Trudell. I mentioned him earlier. One of my favorite quotes: no matter what they ever do to us, we must always act for the love of our people and the earth. We must not react out of hatred against those who have no sense. If you've never heard of John Trudell, he was an actor, he was a musician, and a philosopher. You might have seen him in the movie Thunderheart, I think it was. That's probably one of his most notable roles. And I will leave you with this: the great circle of unity with all things in the universe, including the Great Spirit, our Creator, which is about which all life revolves. We are all equal in the circle. No one is in front of you, no one is behind you. No one is above you, no one is below you. We are all related. And that concludes my presentation.
I have taken part in sweat lodges.
Okay.
And my friend that I was speaking with about earlier, my friend Richard, who is a Native American indigenous person.
Right.
He kind of intimated that it's not right for non-Native people to take part in sweat lodges. I'd like you to speak to that.
Well, a lot of that is going to depend on who is conducting the sweat lodge. And sweat lodges are, like I said, for us, it's like going to church. Yes, and it is hot, and you do sweat. Basically, we enter a lodge that's enclosed, covered with blankets. We bring in rocks that are very, very hot that we pulled out of the fire, put them in a hole in the center of the lodge. And the whole point is you sweat, and it's a catharsis. Can be a very emotional release. In the lodge, it's kind of like what Catholics do when they go to confession. You can divulge whatever is bothering you, whatever is bothering your spirit, and it stays in the lodge. And of course, there are things. We splash water on the rocks, so it creates steam. But we also burn herbs and things. And some of the things are, sage, of course, sweetgrass, and other things. And like I said, it's very cathartic. And as far as people, I personally don't feel like anyone should be excluded, but there are a few restrictions. When women who are during their time of the month are not allowed to enter the lodge. They can sit outside the lodge and sing and pray, but aside from that, and there really aren't that many restrictions. Some people will prefer that to have only men. Some people will conduct a lodge that's only women, and some people actually conduct co-ed lodges. It's not a real big problem.
Thank you for your sobering presentation today. We live in a cumulative time of terrible oppression and mass murder.
Yes.
And these are chilling, stunning experiences to think about. What sense do you have that we as a people, we as all people, can get past this catastrophic tragedy of ill will and mass murder to our fellow people? Number one, I guess that's a question I have. And number two, can you tell us about First Nation people here in Texas, around Central Texas?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Actually, your first question is actually a very good one. It seems to me today that we are divided. There are factions, and there are forces actually creating those factions. When I talk about on my radio show, turn off the TV, quit reading the newspaper. Those are divisive elements. There are people out there who are wanting us to believe that things really are that bad. And they're really not that bad. You go talk to your neighbors. The thing you have to remember about, especially like on social media, and I am on social media a lot because of my job, but you see the worst of things, but there's a lot of good things going on too. The biggest factions I see right now are those, what we refer to as the 1%, who are out to amass fortunes. Once they're gone from this plane, I don't know what good that fortune is going to do them. However, there are other factions who believe in saving the planet, and I think that's where most of my friends fit in, because we're actively trying to do things like fighting pipelines, fracking, and stopping these things that are destructive. We're also working. There are lots of groups being formed. There's a group on one of the reservations called 1,000 Grandmothers. The grandmothers are getting together and actually doing something positive to affect the lives of our growing children, improving education, being mentors, guiding these children. And something I didn't mention is during colonization, excuse me, after colonization, our social structures changed tremendously. Historically, our indigenous cultures were governed by the women. The women were the leaders of our nations. And of course, Europeans couldn't fathom that. There were other things that we did. We never forced any sort of gender identification on anyone. You are who you are, regardless of who that happens to be. But because again, the Europeans, the Christians, or whatever you want to call them, that influence said, well, that's not acceptable. That's heathenism, and you're dancing and praying to whatever. So a lot of things were changed tremendously. What I'm seeing today is that a lot of women are standing up and starting to take their rightful role as leaders. We have 2 women in Congress today, Deb Haaland and Sharice Davis, and they are actually forwarding all sorts of legislation to protect our missing and murdered women. So there's a lot of positive things going on, and the bottom line, though, is there's always got to be some hope. If you believe, one of the things I say I preach is you will create your own reality. If you see the worst in people, that's all you're ever going to see. If you see the best, if you look for the best, you'll find it. As far as your second question, the indigenous cultures here in the state of Texas, I mentioned earlier there are no federally recognized tribes, but there are quite a few state-recognized tribes. Right now, the Lipan Apaches are down at the border trying to protect a cemetery from a wall going through. In San Marcos, and this is a fact I like to brag about a little bit. San Marcos is actually the oldest continuously inhabited site in North America. A lot of people don't know that. The Coahuiltecans, Dr. Garza, my good friend and mentor, is a Coahuiltecan, and they are the original people from Central Texas. Their creation story says they came up to the physical world through the sacred springs, basically. What we know, what used to be called La Corina Springs, no longer commercial. But. Yes, sir. Oh, question.
Thank you. Really an astounding presentation. So you went up to the pipeline.
Yes, ma'am.
And you were there. I was quite amazed. Of course, I hate cold weather, so I was doubly admiring the people that were up there freezing to death at that pipeline event. So what was your takeaway from that? Because now, we have kind of facing the same thing here, and I noticed that San Marcos voted against allowing the pipeline to come through.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's really 2 questions. What is your takeaway from that?
My takeaway from having been up at Standing Rock is hope. When I saw all these different nations from all over the world were coming together, there were tribal nations who had been at war with each other for hundreds of years that were coming together to stand against pipelines. And as far as the cold, actually, I'll be honest, I'm not going to lie, I left before it got really, really bad. But like I said, it was phenomenal to see all these people, and like the cultures from all over the world. We had Maoris, doing hakas at the front lines. We had Hawaiians. We had people from Fiji. And because this fracking and all this fossil fuel extraction is going on everywhere around the world. And now, as I was reading just the other day, the whole concept of fracking is catching on. China wants to start fracking. France wants to start fracking. And what's the point in all that? Fossil fuel is actually on its way out. It's dying. But people don't want to admit that. They want to pump it out of the earth as quickly as possible and make a fortune while they still can.
You gave some statistics that I don't doubt, but I wonder about the cause. There's something like 16 million Native Americans were reduced to hundreds of thousands. I wonder what my understanding, and it may be faulty, was much of this was special diseases that the Europeans brought not on purpose, with no malintent, but it just worked out that way.
Actually, that's a very good point, because yes, disease did decimate part of the population, but that's actually one of those very small fraction. And as far as the disease, yes, it was discovered that smallpox-infected blankets was going to infect the native populations. However, and that one was unintentional to begin with, but when they realized that this was effective, they did it with the Hawaiians. So like I said, but all in all, as far as those numbers of millions of people who died, no, a very small fraction died of disease. A lot of people died of starvation. Our Plains tribes depended on buffalo. Well, people were, these white people, and I don't mean that derogatorily, but these people were actually conducting shooting expeditions from trains and decimating the buffalo populations with the intent on starving the American Indian.
It's been on the news, of course, a lot that Elizabeth Warren had a DNA test and she didn't show any native ancestry, even though her mom in Oklahoma had said she had experienced discrimination because of her native
Right.
identity. And then the different native tribes, am I saying that correctly? Do they have different ways of determining who's in the tribe? Because my understanding is that some adopted people over the years, and that was just a very common custom, and that the Cherokee the Cherokee enslaved African people, and now there are a lot of black Cherokees as well, and that there's some rumbling of trying to get rid of the black Cherokees within, I don't know to call that racism or colorism or what.
It's racism.
And yeah, that's what it seems like. And yeah, and that's so how would you find out if it's not DNA? How would a person know if they wanted to get to know which tribe that their ancestors had been part of?
That's an excellent question. True, there have been black Cherokees, there are black Seminoles, and some of them were enslaved. And indigenous people did have slaves. They were slaveholders. Some of them, not all of them, another small percentage. But when slaves were running away, and they were openly accepted in many tribes, and of course they became part of the tribe, they intermarried and had children. Now, getting back to the DNA question, right, DNA is not everything. You know, a lot of people put a whole lot of credence on DNA results, but when it comes right down to as far as finding out what your tribal heritage is, you really need to talk to your elders. You need to find out, do your genealogy research. That's going to take you back. Now, as far as being accepted as a member of a tribe, each nation has their own requirements. Some nations required for enrollment on their rolls will say you have to be at least 50%, or 1/8, but it varies, and that brings up a couple of good points too. The fact that people who are black, all it takes is one drop of black blood and you're considered black. For indigenous people, it works the opposite way. We are the only ethnic group in the United States that have to prove our ethnicity. And if you don't meet a certain standard, you're not accepted. And there is a lot of dissension between the full bloods and the half bloods. The other thing to remember too is that because we are the only ethnic group in the United States to to prove our ethnicity, this is something we refer to as paper genocide. Because after a certain point, when the bloodline's thin, they know, well, not that they've ever honored any treaties, but after the bloodline's thin to a certain point, then we no longer exist.
Okay.
There you go.
Historically, white people thought that they had to be the saviors. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how can we here in Central Texas and around the country support indigenous people without trying to be the messiahs?
Well, and that's another very good question. Boy, all these great questions. As far as being supportive, it's like being an ally for any other marginalized group, LGBTQIA, black people, Asian people. Be a friend. Don't assume to know anything. Don't try to explain to us what they're feeling or what their experience has been. And read. And there's a lot of places. I mean, I tell people in an age of electronic information, ignorance is a choice. And please don't ever base your opinion on someone else's opinion. The information is available. And Carolyn and I were talking about books to read. The one by Red Cloud you were mentioning. anyway, there are lots of good books out there, and I wish I had been prepared for that. But and I was telling Carolyn also that there's a site on the internet that gives a very good historical list from before Columbus sailed to the present on incidents, not just the massacres and not all the things that have been going on, but things that are significant in our indigenous history. Also keep in mind that what you see on the television, what you read in the newspapers, and even the history books, no one's got it right. No one's going to get it right unless you hear it directly, from an indigenous perspective. I have a friend who does a radio show, and they were talking about these wonderful books written by this, I forgot who it was, about indigenous cultures. After the show, she asked me, well, what'd you think? And I had to tell her, I said, these books that you love so much were written by a white person. And unless you actually live in that culture, you're never really going to get the full flavor of it. But be an ally. Just read, and the information is there. It really is available. And don't believe anything in the history books, nothing in the movies, although there are some really good movies being made by indigenous producers these days.
The title of the book was Black Elk Speaks. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
This is kind of two questions, I guess. One's religious and one's historical. That is that you referred to the group in San Marcos and their creation myth.
Yes.
Their creation story. Shouldn't call it a myth, but their creation story. And so what is your historical creation story? And in addition to that, this is a political question. I believe he's still alive. Is there any chance that Leonard Peltier will ever be released from prison?
Yes, probably not. As far as the Leonard Peltier question, appeals have been filed for him ever since he's been exonerated. The evidence proved that he didn't do what he was claimed to do, but he is a political prisoner in our prison system. Leonard Peltier, for those of you who don't know, was part of the occupation at Wounded Knee back in the 70s. There were, I believe, 2 or 3 FBI agents that were killed. He was blamed, and he's been exonerated, but he still sits in prison. Appeals have been given have gone to several presidents since then. No one is going to. I don't think they're going to release him. He's in his 70s now, and he's in failing health. As far as my creation history, I'm not going to lie to you. I did not grow up indigenous. I grew up here in Texas, in San Antonio, in the 1950s. Back then, it was bad enough being identified as a Mexican-American kid. And in the 1950s, here in the state of Texas, you could still kill a native and never have to stand trial. So we didn't talk about that. It wasn't until I became an adult and started realizing, and like I was telling Carolyn earlier, there were a lot of things that weren't making sense when I was growing up as a kid that make a whole lot of more sense to me now. But I do self-identify as an Apache. Probably Mescalero, but I can't prove anything. Well, you have to. It depends on which Apache nation you're talking to. There's a White Mountain, Mescalero, anyway, there's several of them.
What about San Marcos and their stand on the pipeline? Would you share with us?
Oh, that's okay. That's currently in the news. Yes, we are fighting a pipeline in San Marcos, the Permian Highway gas pipeline that's being proposed by Kinder Morgan. Now, we have a very active group in San Marcos, and the San Marcos City Council actually voted against the pipeline. But in all honesty, that really isn't going to have a whole lot of weight on it, because a couple of things to keep in mind. This particular pipeline, they're trying to run it from West Texas out to the Gulf Coast. Because it's not crossing any state lines, here's the kicker. They're not required to do an environmental impact statement by law. And pipelines are also regulated by the Railroad Commission here in Texas. And not to get political, well, I'm not even going to go there. But the pipeline, the bottom line is, if they can say, well, we're going to take your land by eminent domain. Now, there are proposals, there are bills being proposed and trying to get passed in the state legislature about eminent domain laws. Eminent domain doesn't really apply here, but it still carries a lot of weight. And for those of you who aren't aware of eminent domain, for any landowner who's land that pipeline is going to cross, they will negotiate. They'll make an offer for the land to either lease or buy the throughway on that property. And some people will actually fight it, but it's a very expensive proposition. It takes lots and lots of money, lots of time in court. The bottom line is always, if someone just doesn't want to agree, they can say, well, we're going to take the property by eminent domain. You know, eminent domain technically is for the welfare of the population. The only people who are making out on this deal are the owners. And one thing I will say about Kinder Morgan, they have the worst safety inspection record of all the pipelines in the country. They are also known for robbing their safety inspection budgets in order to line the pockets of their investors. That's all I'm going to say about Kinder Morgan. Try to not keep it political. Yes?
Say you're a great presenter. Can you tell us what your other 2 radio shows are?
Oh, actually I have one other radio show. My 2 radio shows, as I mentioned, Indigenous Freedom Radio on Saturdays from 2 to 4 p.m. We are on the internet. We do not broadcast. The advantage for that, of course, is that you can listen to us anywhere in the world where you have an internet signal. One of my daughters, when she was in England, used to listen to my program every Saturday, which was way cool. I have a Veterans Hour on Monday afternoons from 5 to 6 p.m., and we discuss, obviously, veterans issues.
Looking ahead a generation or 2 from here, say 50 years down the road, what kind of changes in indigenous society and federal and state laws that are pertinent to them, what kind of changes would you like to see?
You know, I'm glad you asked me that, because there's a quote I just love to use. Chief Seattle, one of my favorite quotes of Chief Seattle was, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." When indigenous people talk about the legacy they're leaving behind for their children, we're not just looking at our immediate children or our grandchildren. We look 7 generations down the line. What are we going to leave for them? Things are changing. Deb Haaland and Sharice David are not the only indigenous people who are holding office these days. There are over 100 other positions throughout the country. Not all of them, on the national level, but there were a lot of state level positions that were filled by indigenous people. Like I said, always be fearful of an educated Indian. And we're more and more, the push is to get our people educated and active, proactive, and things will change. Like I said, the bottom line, you always have to have hope.
Are there any events coming up this spring that we could take part in?
Oh, actually, there is a powwow in Georgetown on April the 13th at was it Southwestern University up there? Anyway, the university up there. Corbin J. Robertson Activity Center. April 13th, there's a Native American powwow. I will be there. Normally, I do live broadcasts from powwows. But this one, I'm just going to go enjoy myself. We're not even going to try to call in or anything to the studio. I'm just going to go to dance. I don't get to do that very often. But yes, that April 13th, there's that powwow. I'm trying to think. In May, there's one in Laredo. I will be the master of ceremonies at that one.
Do you know what day in May?
May 18th. Okay. It's a Saturday. So if you want to drive down to Laredo, come down and say hello. I'll be sitting at the master of ceremonies table. One thing I would like to give a real quick plug to, I have a friend who's a filmmaker who is getting ready to release her first documentary called Keep the Fires Lit, The Lost Tribes of Texas. Now, she and I have gotten together, we're collaborating, and we're having a meeting on the 19th of this month at the film school in Austin on Tillery Street. I don't have the exact address right off the top of my head, but we're basically going to be having, everyone's heard about South by Southwest, that big mess downtown. Well, we're going to have our own our arts festival, the Indigenous Arts Festival. We're scheduling something big. It's going to be a major event next year, so we're already starting to work on it. We're looking at like film, live performances with music, and we're probably even going to give awards to indigenous musicians and filmmakers. So keep an eye out for that. Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, the Austin Powwow is in November, and that is held at the Expo Center out on Decker Lane. And like I said, that's usually the first weekend in November. Actually, my wife and I were part of that powwow for 20 years, and now we're part of the Sacred Springs Powwow. And Sacred Springs Powwow in San Marcos this year, we already have a date, October 18th and 19th. And of all the powwows I've ever been to, I have to tell you, not just because I'm part of this one, but the Sacred Springs Powwow, when you come onto the grounds of the Medical Center, there's a power, just something, you feel it when you come onto the grounds, and it's a very special place. But like I said, this is also the place of origin of the Coahuiltecans, and it's the Coahuiltecan families that are actually originated this powwow. The Indigenous Cultures Institute, Dr. Mario Garzan, his wife Maria Rocha.
So I've never been to a powwow. What kind of, I'll have to come. What should I expect? What kind of, how many hours does it take? Like,
okay,
what time
well,
of day does it
the one in Georgetown starts, I believe, at 11 and goes till about 9 o'clock. And we start out with a Gourd Dance, which is the dance that I do. Gourd Dance is generally done by veterans, old warriors, and it takes about an hour for the Gourd Dance. We actually dance, old guys, we actually dance longer than anybody else. But the Gourd Dance is actually a prayer dance. Well, like I said, they're all prayers, but we basically bless the arena with the Gourd Dance. That will be followed by a grand entry, where all the different dance styles, all the different people who are participating will march into the drum, and that is actually quite a sight to see. Of course, then there'll be other categories, individual categories, and the Georgetown powwow, there are two types of powwows we refer to. This is a non-competition. By non-competition, meaning that you can come dance, but there's no prize money. However, Austin Powwow, for example, is a competition powwow. Dancers come from all over the country and compete against each other. And there are lots of people who actually support themselves by doing the powwow trail, one powwow after the other. And if you go to powwows.com, you will find powwows being listed all over the country. If you're going to travel to Maine, look, you can type in Maine and see what powwows are going on up there at the time or whatever.
Thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.